Cassie Williams, and for my final project, I did research into how presidential social media has an effect on the stock market. So just a background, the conversation started with the people that I work with who actually invest in the stock market, and then bringing up their concern that President Trump's tweets have an effect on the stock market. So I decided to do some research and found actually some very interesting articles. The first one that I found was about JP Morgan creating an index that tracks the effect of President Trump's tweets on the stock market. And they actually found that out of 4,000 tweets that they analyzed, 146 they said were market moving. And those were ones that mentioned things like China, billions, and products. Another one that I found was the Bank of America started doing an investigation into the number of tweets and how that affects the stock market, and actually found that there was a correlation, and that when Trump tweets more than he usually does, there was negative effects that day in the stock market, and then when he actually tweeted less than usual, then there was actually positive returns in the stock market. I also found a paper in 2011 that was an investigation of how the mood of Twitter users could be used to predict the stock market. So with all of these combined, I thought this would be a really interesting area to research. So for my project, the data gathering, I used two different websites. So I wanted to get a historical log of all of President Trump's tweets over the last year. So I used tweets from September 26 to 2018 to the September 26, 2019 from TrumpTwitterArchive.com. From there, I broke down his tweets into number of tweets, the number of retweets for those tweets, the sentiment of those tweets, which I used a machine learning tool called Vader, which actually tells me how positive, negative, or neutral, and also a compound score for his tweets, and then the number of tweets per given category. So how many times a tweet would mention Democrat wall, fake news, or Russia. There were also some other categories. And then a historical log of 3 different stock indexes, Dow, NASDAQ, and S&P 500 were used, and I got to that from barcharts.com. So the research and statistical questions that I wanted to answer was, is there a difference in the change between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. given the number of times Trump sends out a tweet in the previous 24-hour period? Is there a difference in the change in the stock market between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. given how many times Trump mentions Democrats? These two were actually chosen. I looked at all of the different variables, and these two actually had some interesting results to report on. And then the last one, I wanted to see if I could create a prediction model to predict the 9 a.m. high values for each of the indexes as well. So for the explanatory data analysis, I wanted to look at tweet and retweet counts, and something to point out was these were very linearly correlated. So actually both of these variables, I ended up getting rid of retweet count for the prediction model. But I did want to show that 2,850 tweets were used over this year period. And the most number of times Trump tweeted within a 24-hour period was 37, and the least number of times he tweeted was 1. Here is the number of tweets that mention a certain category over the little over 2,000 tweets that I used for this analysis. So you can see that great was mentioned in 564 of those tweets, and China was only mentioned in 121 of those tweets. Looking at tweet sentiment, like I said, I used a tool called Vader, which splits into how positive, negative, neutral, and also a compound score. So you can also see that there are linear correlations between the compound score and negative, positive, and neutral. So all of these variables were not also used for the prediction analysis. But it is interesting that for all the tweets used, 198 of those actually had a positive compound score, and then only 53 of those actually had a negative compound score. So overall, his tweets were pretty positive. So over the year period, like I said, looking at 3 different index, S&P 500, Dow, and NASDAQ, and these are the plots of them over the year period. And then for looking at the 9 a.m. high values, these are the 9 a.m. high values for each of these stock indexes over the year period as well, and S&P 500 and Dow look really, really similar to each other. So for the first part, looking at the how the number of tweets in a 24-hour period affected the change between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. Then I'll go into talking about how differences in how many times Democrats are mentioned had an effect between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. And then also a predictive analysis to see if we can predict the 9 a.m. high value. So the first part is, over 24-hour period before 9 a.m., can the number of tweets be broken down into different groups using a one-way ANOVA to see if there's a difference between these two groups of how many times he tweeted and the change in the stock market? So the most number of tweets was 37, the average number of tweets was 11, and the lowest number was 1. So those got broken down into 1 to 8, 9 to 14, and 15 to 37 number of tweets. So for S&P 500, there was a significant difference between the average and the above average number of tweets and how the stock market changed. And for above average, so when he tweeted more, there was actually an increase in the stock market. And for an average number, there was actually a decrease in the stock market. And this is for S&P 500. When we look at Dow, there was actually not a significant difference between these three categories. So that one did not have significant results, but then NASDAQ did have significant results. And it's the same. It's the difference between average and above average. So for above average, there's less of a decrease than when he just tweeted an average number of times. So the second part, looking into the number of times, number of tweets that mentioned Democrats, got broken down into 3 different categories as well. So below average was just 0 or 1 number of tweets mentioning Democrats. Average is 1 to 2 tweets, and then more than average was 2 to 8 tweets, since 8 was the most number of tweets that mentioned Democrats in the 24-hour period. So looking at S&P 500, we can see that there is significant differences between average and above average, and then average and below average. And the interesting thing here is when he mentions Democrats an average number of times, there's actually an increase in the market between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. But then for above and below average, we can see a decrease there if we look at the mean values. So same thing for the Dow index. There's a significant difference. And when it's an average number of times, there's an increase. And then when there is above or below average, we actually see a decrease. And then this is the exact same thing for NASDAQ, which is super interesting that for the mention of Democrats, it's the same for all 3. But we do see for above average and below average, there is a decrease. And then on average, there's an increase. The only one that was significant, though, for NASDAQ was between average and above average. And then the last portion was looking at, can we use the Trump tweets to actually predict the 9 a.m. high value? So when dealing with time series data, you actually want to make sure that our residual assumptions are still met, that they're identically and independently distributed. So if a model has residual errors that actually follow a time series model, we need to account for that because we need to make sure our predictions are still met. So in order to do this, I went ahead and broke out my data into a training and test set, and then went ahead and used best subsets regression. So for actually all 3 models, I got a prediction model with some significant variables. For S&P 500, the only significant one was count. And then I did see that over time, the residual errors did follow a time series model, actually an autoregressive model. So I had to add that into the model to account for that. And then my count variable was no longer significant. And that was actually the same for Dow and NASDAQ as well. So this actually means that that a model cannot be made and meet the assumptions. So it came out that I wasn't able to create a prediction model. So some of the similarities that I mentioned was that NASDAQ and S&P 500 both saw less of a decrease in the stock market change given Trump number of tweets. All of the indexes show a negative change in the stock market when Democrats are mentioned less or more frequently than usual. And I couldn't create a prediction model for any of the 3 indexes. So some considerations going forward is to investigate other times. So I did the change between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m., but between 12 and 4 could also be investigated. And then since the count was a significant predictor before the AR1 variable was put in for the residuals, it might be interesting to add number of Trump tweets into a model that is already used for predicting the stock market, just to see if that could actually help improve the model. So thank you for your time, and that is my presentation.